I hope you all remembered your questions. I see a lady over there to the right.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers for fantastic lectures, and apologies to Dr. Cox for my phone going off during his.
No.
I've got a comment for Anthony, because the man you showed in the red waistcoat, which you thought was either 1744 or 1746, is on obviously twill canvas, a diagonal weave, which is very, very rare in British painting, in my experience, in the 1740s. And then the one you showed of James Stanley, and there's no doubt that that's by Stubbs. Am I right?
Well, there's a transcribed inscription on the back, which would indicate.
That looks as if it might be on twill too. And in looking in the exhibition, some of the 60s paintings are on very fine twill. And again, it's still quite unusual then. It starts to be very common in the 1770s. So I would have thought, looking for twill canvas in early Stubbs might be just another pointer.
Very interesting
got
point.
An early one there. Thank you.
Where else have you seen that?
Well, it's very common in sort of John Riley and some of Richardson's work,
Yeah.
and then you just really don't see it much, or hardly at all, in my experience, in the 1740s.
Right, Richardson Senior.
Yeah. Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, Stubbs obviously took an interest in Richardson.
Did he?
I think because he went to a lot of the places, according to Humphrey anyway, that appear in Richardson's Guide to Rome.
Right.
Which was republished the year he goes to Rome.
Okay.
But anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
I see a hand over there in the back. Gentlemen.
Thanks. I guess we're going to all come from this from different angles. Thank you very much for the exhibition. I really enjoyed that. I'm a vet, or been a vet for 40 years, working with horses, and been a surgeon, so I know a bit about anatomy. Certainly those pictures of his anatomical studies are very interesting, and you can appreciate the difficulties you'd have working on a horse back at that time. I just feel that in some of his paintings, and I don't know if any of you are anatomists enough to be able to concur or disagree with me, but some of them don't appear like horses at all. For example, the Eclipse horse, the head is very long and narrow, the neck is sort of like a swan neck, more like a swan than a horse, and the back's very sort of straight and very long. So to me, they don't appear like proper horses. He's always sort of called an anatomist. Obviously, stylization is completely allowed by an artist, but I'd be interested to have anyone's comments as to whether you think he was stylizing paintings of Eclipse, or whether that was the way he saw it and that was his view on anatomy. There are a few other anatomical anomalies which I thought was interesting. One of his engravings with the lion jumping on top of the horse. The horse is gaping its mouth wide. People always think that certainly has been a mistake, that when they open their mouth, they're hinging from a few inches behind the teeth, whereas in fact they're hinging right from the back of the jaw. And to get the jaw into that position, it would have to be a fractured jaw. So I'd just be interested whether it's just me who sees them like that, people who live with horses, whether they feel some of the paintings are not anatomically correct due to bad proportion.
I don't think any of you are really anatomists.
Well, the only comment I would make to that prima facie is that I never met Basil Taylor, but he got interested in Stubbs not as an art historian, but as a vet. And then he became interested in the artistic aspects of Stubbs. And I don't know whether I presume it didn't trouble him, even though he was a professional.
I might also add...
I wouldn't want to denigrate Stubbs for the work he did. He is one of my favourite artists, and I wouldn't be here if he wasn't. But I think he's been given a bit of a free ride with his anatomy. Certainly looking at those anatomical studies, I think if they were done today in better circumstances, that you would get a very different picture. Some of them are very weak back end and too long a back and too many ribs and things like that.
I was going to say that I think I can't really speak to the anatomy itself, but I would say something like the lion attacking the horse. It's absolutely based, on ancient models, on I think probably Susini bronze. That's quite a specific sub kind of category in which he's inheriting that model from previous artists. But similarly, I would say that I'm struck by, and I don't know that anyone has ever worked on this. Again, the anatomy, I have no idea actually, but the conventions of representation, the tendency to show a horse as a flank, the painting that I showed with the added background, the horse from 3 angles to give you the most information. Those are kind of conventions of, just as in botany, as in anatomy, I assume, that can start to skew accuracy. I don't know, but that's...
I think even when you look at whistle jackets, there's also idealization happening there, especially when you get an opportunity right now in the exhibition to make a comparison with the other painting with an actual portrait of whistle jackets. It looks different, and I think also in the case of whistle jackets, you can see that pictorial tradition does play out, even with Stubbs. Of course, that's not the way he would like us to think about his work, but I think it's really, really intriguing to hear your opinion from the perspective of an anatomist. Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. I'm also a veterinary surgeon, and I came over from the USA, so David's not alone.
I could mess up names together. If you were worried, I thought I stand no chance.
I did it to make you feel at home.
So I was actually surprised to be a little bit of the counterpoint that one of the brood mares in the Mare and Foal series has a sacroiliac hunter bump. So I suppose it's sort of, did he portray those horses realistically or perfectly? And obviously the anatomy is the anatomy, that doesn't change, but conformation does. So was he trying to, as you say, stylize and idealize them to please the people who commissioned the paintings? I think that may play a role.
There's a question here up front.
Thank you very much indeed for a fantastic different set of perspectives this afternoon and indeed this morning. And well done, Anthony, on organising it all, because it's really hard to put this together, teamwork. Just without wishing to kind of completely open up to another topic, one of the things that intrigued me in the exhibition was Stubbs as revolutionary in a sense. I mean, the link with Wedgwood and the different styles of painting that he did. Because I guess historically in England we think of him as an equine aristocrat painter, but actually he was connected with those lunar men in Birmingham. And I just wondered whether any of the panel had any thoughts in that territory without wishing for another paper, because that's probably a conference on its own.
I mean, from my perspective, as a caveat, this is an 18th century historian rather than an art historian. I think it's clear that he's a remarkably inventive, remarkably ambitious in trying out and experimenting with new media, even where they may not have a particularly commercial outlet. So I think the idea that we frame Stubbs only as someone interested in daubing horses for posh boys, which is one way of reading his 1760s oeuvre, I think. That sits alongside this remarkably, experimental, remarkably committed artist interested in pushing the boundaries in a whole variety of different ways. So I think the two do coexist, and it would be interesting, yes, to do more on Stubbs as experimental artist, definitely.
Just have a small thing to add to that. The scientific experimentation also puts him in very close relationship with the French as well, and lots of very sort of progressive scientific experimentation. his interest in painting on ceramic surfaces and on enamel and things relates to French artists who were arguing in the same decades about how ancient encaustic painting was done, and different artists had different ideas about how it had been done and tried to revive it. And the Reynolds and people who collaborated with Wedgwood, for example, both were connected with those French arguments as well. So it's a very international scientific experimentation, I think.
And if I can interject, so that extends to the use of wax.
Yes, yes. Encaustic is the creation of wax, which was considered to be one of the ways of having everlasting colour, whichever.
Yeah, it's an obsession with the color, which is interesting. Yeah.
So if these were such international concerns, how come Stubbs is so little known outside of the UK?
We're changing it now, but
Yeah, we had Brussels in 1929, you know, The Hague in 2020. There we go, job done.
there we are.
Okay, well, my name is Tatiana, and I'm very grateful to Leah, who make excuses for her accent, and I'm making excuses for my accent because I came from Ukraine. And it was like a must for nearly every citizen in Ukraine to go to museums, galleries, art, opera, ballet. And we had the table card game about art, with the paintings and with the artists, and we were competing how many names we know of the paints and artists, but there was no name of George Stubbs. And being connected to the gallery for a long time, when I came and saw the exhibition, it was not quite familiar name for me, so thank you very much for introducing him. And my question is, because he was born 250 years ago, and he was not that famous, and I realized that many artists at that time, they died in poverty, maybe not in his case, but many artists died in poverty. And it means that the people like Paul Mellon, who actually had these three ingredients like money, love to art, and love to horses, raised his profile, and because of him, we know more about George Stubbs, and it is amazing. So my question is, how much the talent of the artist, dependent on the people who appreciate his art, and how much the attitude of the public to the talent and genius of the artist depending on the money which the paint cost. Like, for example, we all read information on website, and I read that his painting were in 1960, 70, and it was something like 200, 300 pounds, and now Whistle Jacket costs millions and millions. And now we understand that he is genius. So do you plan, the question again, the second question, do you plan in your art circles to make a day, internationally, globally, appreciation of the dealers, of the people like Paul Mellon, who actually bring to the public, and who is more genius, Paul Mellon or George Stubbs?
Well, they could both be geniuses. I did know Paul Mellon a bit, and I did have a chance to talk to him about Stubbs, because he used to, John Basket, who used to advise him, he used to have the office above mine in Bond Street. He was a very quiet man, but he was extremely passionate about Stubbs, and something had obviously connected with him. And I remember having a conversation that when he was at Cambridge, he had gone to Newmarket and seen a picture by Stubbs in a private collection that had struck him tremendously. It was you need a genius to make a great picture, but you also, you need to be a genius to recognize genius. So you actually need both. And then if they're rich, the money flows. If it doesn't really matter. But the fact is, the conversation has happened. But the problem is, how do you sustain that over generations? And that was what was so important about the Whitechapel show in the 50s, is that kick-started something which we are experiencing now, and has got still a long way to go, because there's still a lot we don't know. And it's a type of genius that this generation appreciates in the way that was not necessarily the case in the recent past. And that will only increase, in my view.
I would also say that in the case of Stubbs and Mellon, not to suggest anything negative about Mellon, who have invited me here this evening, but the fact that he assembled so many works by Stubbs. So I guess my point is the concentrations of works by Stubbs are very high in a set number of places. You see all of the private collection things here, which are heavily, I think, descendants of the families, so they're in country houses wherever they might be, here in England. And in the US, all of these Stubbses are in New Haven at Yale, which is incredible if you can get to New Haven. I'm at the Met, we have one sort of okay looking Stubbs. It doesn't mean it diffused, and so that means that's why an exhibition like this is so important, especially as it travels, I think, is because there are amazing groups in certain places. In the US, unless you go to the Huntington or to New Haven, you're unlikely to encounter, or Virginia actually, which was a Mellon Museum of Fine Arts there that he supported. I mean, the point is just that it has to do with diffusion as well.
There's one last question.
Hi. Well, I'm a landscape historian, as Ollie well knows, with a special interest in capability brown. And looking through the landscape, the pictures with the landscapes in the background, we do have one or two recognisable ones, particularly Cresswell Crags. But I'm sure somewhere there's a crossover between Capability Brown's commissions and the patrons who had Stubbs paint their horses as well. But most of the backgrounds are unrecognisable, and I've made a list of the ones that seem to have Capability Brown connections. And it's interesting that they weren't painting the horses in a recognisable landscape by a master who they'd employed and paid the equivalent of millions of pounds to. So they weren't, the obvious place would be to situate the horse in the landscape that Capability Brown had done, but that doesn't seem to happen. It's more of an observation than a question, unless Ollie wishes to make a comment.
I suppose the only thing that I would say is I think the Stubbs works are trying perhaps to do something slightly different in terms of architectural specificity, and I'm thinking particularly of the works around the rubbing houses at Newmarket, which is I think it's around, certainly for those patrons of the turf, it's about evoking an almost visceral emotional memory of the moment when your horse triumphed. And I think that's the significance about Stubbs' strength in those particular works, which is that they are so evocative if your horse has done well at that place. And you will always remember that particular moment. And I think maybe that's a bit more, maybe that has a bit more emotive power than, your new bridge or your new dam. Not to do Brown down at all, but I do, to continue your thought there, Sarah, I think there's a really, really interesting almost sort of trifecta here between, this new generation of aristocrats on the make in the early 1760s that cluster around Rockingham, the Marquess of Rockingham, who are increasingly politically significant from the early 1760s onwards. Their patronage of, landscape design on a larger scale with Brown, plus a sort of new commitment and investment in the sort of technology of breeding around thoroughbred racehorses, and indeed the racehorses themselves, which I think are a fundamental way of reinforcing both familial and political bonds. So I think within that Brown design landscape, a new generation plus horses, you have a really, really interesting sort of, that equals something really exciting that we should do more research on, would be my answer. Yeah.
I just really had a question for Anthony. I mean, you charted out this lacuna of these early years from Liverpool through to Yorkshire, 15 years, and so few paintings, portraits survive. Obviously the big question is, where are these pictures? They must be plenty of them.
Well,
you must have thought about this a great deal.
Two of the citations were simply a problem of recognition. So, for example, the picture in the Ferrens of George of Fothergill, the draper, 1746, pretty secure. That had been attributed to somebody in the Gainsborough Circle by Ellis Waterhouse in 1954. So that had set everything, the hair running in the wrong direction. And it was Christopher Wright who pulled it back and said, hang on a minute. So it's It's a question of re-examining the first question, really, which can be the wrong one. And that's the Swinnerton portrait of Walter Smythe. Somebody said in 1910, that's by Pickering, because Pickering worked for the family, and nobody ever bothered to ask the question again. So it's a question of re-examining assumptions, which is the role of the historian.
Well, it's left to me to thank everybody for today's contributions. Thank you very much, Leah, and the panel, and Roger. And I'm hoping that